Section 1 of Unmasked, or the Science of Immorality, to Gentlemen. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Pamela Nagami, M.D. Unmasked, or the Science of Immorality, to Gentlemen, by Mary Edwards Walker. Chapter 1. Introduction. A number of private treatises have been written to women exclusively by men physicians. This was before women were regular MDs, or before any woman had many years' practice in the profession. If women generally can be benefited by such books, it is but fair to suppose that men generally may be benefited by women physicians writing private treatises to men, embodying advice, facts, observations, discoveries, etc., that are all important for men to learn in a pure way as matters of science, instead of acquiring with the most degraded ideas of life, and only such parts as are demoralizing and filled with the grossest errors. It is very evident that the great need of light among men has not been properly met by men. No man has elaborated on important points in the direction that is most vital, and hence it becomes the duty of whomsoever can peer into the darkness with a light to do so with all speed. Even if such light be no larger than a glow-worm, it may be the humble means of guiding many a weary one into a lost path, and of preventing myriads from losing the path of rectitude who are now approaching manhood, to say nothing about those in the great future whose need for light shall be as great as those now traveling in the bewildering paths of existence. Knowledge must ever be the basic principle upon which the purest morals are founded. It is upon this cornerstone of life's monumental building that grand towers of soul reach the zenith of human excellence in middle age and are crowned with the beautiful verdure of ripe years' real worth. With all the strides that have been made in art and science for the past 100 years, the philanthropist must view with the deepest sorrow that but little progress has been made in morals, so little that the men who even make pretensions to purity of manhood are conspicuously few. The majority of men have no high moral standard, but without shame assert that they are as good as any other men, and carry the idea that, as they have become self-complacent, women ought to be satisfied with whatever standard of morals men choose to be reconciled to for themselves. Men would be amazed if women should assert that such a standard was a low one and did not correspond with a true woman's ideals of noble manhood, and that it was just as good a standard for woman's morale as it is for men's, a position that is just as fair for women to take as for men, as anyone with logic must admit. Women feel this inequality most poignantly, and deplore the low position taken by men, as few men can ever understand. Women's silence upon the subject mislead men into the idea that they are indifferent to men's morals. Men never hear the eloquent speeches of women of all ages when this subject is discussed in the homes of all grades of women, and the despair that settles over their faces as the want of pure manhood is felt by them, with no hope of ever having the general ideas of men any better, and women being compelled to marry such men if they ever marry at all. While men are so ignorant of the real aspirations of women, they will continue to wrong them. Men assume a right to have all relationships with women outside of marriage because they are men, and then assume the right to desert such women as beneath their contempt, and illogically reasoning both ways, assert that such women are not equals with them, because they yielded when unable either mentally or physically or financially to resist them. Every art, often not at all understood by woman, is used to entrap her into such relationship when she does not fully understand the strength of her own passions, and certainly not of men's, and she is placed in a position where she cannot possibly be forewarned, if not forewarned in a manner to make her disrespect all manhood, in a word, to be constantly on the alert, believing every man a seducer. If he is not such, it is not for want of encouragement from the great masses of men in the following way. The arts and traps of seduction are talked over by men before boys, and so the youths grow up in the belief that there is something smart in taking advantage of women, and that it is the most telling evidence of manhood possible. Brought up in such a school, it is more a misfortune than a fault that men as a mass have so little moral conscience, for there is little or no direct influence to counteract such schooling, and the lessons in defective conscience and low ebb of soul are so often given that the most poisonous and deleterious stuff becomes a part of the man. It is true that pernicious teachings are graded to some extent among men and boys in the different classes of society. But the same ideas of their immoral rights that men believe to be their prerogative as men, that all other men are called upon to respect as rights, and women to tolerate, are the bases of jokes, good-natured slanders, and pleasantry. Men tacitly acknowledge each other's right to their own code of morals, and an exclusive right to their own victims is asserted with threats, fists, and bullets. Such decisions of the rights of weak-moraled men to weak-minded women are heralded almost every day. The thieves of women's self-respect have wide ranges of codes of honor. Such men call those who live better lives than themselves fools, and those who live worse ones brutes, which is an insult to the brute creation, since no animal can be found that is as bad as some men. The masses of men do not believe that one man ever lived except Christ, who did not exercise what he deemed manhood rights in degrading some women, and there are men who even doubt Christ's pure life in this regard. There are many restraining influences with men, but the greatest is fear, without which the exercise of the basest passions, or rather the violation of the natural laws, would be so great that the race would soon become extinct. But the fear is not concerning the results on the soul or body of their victims, but that their own bodies may suffer from some law that shall be enforced in the shape of disease, or of some human law that is administered by individuals in the shape of cold lead globes or sharp-pointed steel, if not in prison cells or in hemp circles. Where no common law prevails, men treat women as though they had not a single right of existence, and but for their living, adding to men's sexual gratification, they would not be allowed to live at all. Where common law does prevail, women are constantly writhing under the inequality of law as regards sex, and men are so annoyed that to have peace, more and more just laws are enacted by them. Laws are made by men who have not a remote idea of living up to them, believing themselves clever enough to infringe them without publicity, and thus pass for much better men than they really are, while the selfish making of protection laws is for the double purposes of protecting their victims for their own use, whether such women be wives or mistresses. And yet men have failed to enact laws of this character that are sufficiently potential to do away with the necessity for individual administration of bullet or knife law. A certain class of men are restrained by nothing less potent than this kind of law, and but for such law being occasionally administered by the relatives of women or by the victimized women themselves, there would be much more of iniquity than there is at present, although one is almost led to exclaim, how can the world be much worse than it is? There is a fearful moral confusion that certainly appalls one who looks upon every grade of society as it really is. While every man has his code of honor in relation to women, nearly all of these codes can be summed up in the following list. Number 1, the code of a pure life, where no sexual wrongs to himself or to a woman have ever existed, but where every woman is treated with the same deference as though she was his honored mother or sister, where his wife is treated with all the acknowledged rights as though she were physically stronger than himself and perfectly independent of him in all regards. That there are so few with this code is why there is so much of contention, strife, rapes, seductions, and murders. There can be none of these evils where men live up to the noble standard of true manhood. Number 2, the code of sowing wild oats and then marrying a pure girl and settling down and priding himself on being one of the very best of men, never once dreaming that there can be any better specimens of manhood, or thinking that he has any obligations to that pure girl in keeping himself pure for her, as she has been keeping herself for him. Number 3, the code of living life. Number 2, being equally careful not to have any slanders in the shape of illegitimate children, and like number 2, boasting that they never visited a public woman or seduced a girl, but all through life having relationship, sexual, with so-called respectable women, married and single. Sometimes men with this code marry, and sometimes they do not, but always living the same life, making their marriage a convenience if they ever do conclude to marry, and with their associates talking jocosely over the convenience of having a wife when there are reasons why it is not policy or pleasure to go elsewhere. They use every art to keep their wives in the belief of their faithfulness to them, and laugh at the idea of a jealous thought in them, or frown and become angry at such a suspicion. Number 4, the code of this class is to visit reputable houses, talk up marriage, court several different girls, taking precaution to have them in different places or in different circles of society, seduce under promise of marriage, through force or fear, help them out of enceinte condition, carry on the game until he wearies of his victim, or she, finding he will not marry her, discards him. Those of this class boast that they are as good as any men among their chums. They boast of their conquests and get rid of some of their victims by getting some other fellow to play the same game and then twit the girl with unfaithfulness to them as a cause for desertion. Number 5, the code of this class is to visit disreputable houses, make bargains and sales, and would despise seducing girls or invading other men's families. Pure sexual gratification is the one idea, and the quality is little to be considered. More married men than single ones patronize such houses. We shall give the reasons, therefore, hereafter. This class treat respectful women with much more deference than the seducers who boast of never going into a bad house. And number 6, the code of this class is to be constantly on the alert for victims, and their thirst for variety leads them into the most dishonorable means to accomplish ends. Rapes are committed by them, and even small girls are victims. End of Section 1. Section 2 of Unmasked, or the Science of Immorality, to Gentlemen, by Mary Edwards Walker. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 2, Equality. If men would only reason, they would very soon understand that the true position of women is always one of equality with themselves in all the relations of life. This is true, taken not only from the most just, humane, and noble standpoints, but from the most interested and selfish ones. For not only are the children stronger, healthier, more intellectual, and less irritable, having a stronger hold on life, but from the merest sensual motives, this is true. Where the wife is simply a grown-up governed child, always more or less under the dominant will of the husband, she can never give the strength and satisfaction to the husband in the sexual relation that she would if an individualized woman, with all the distinct magnetic power that only such women can impart. The more of selfhood a woman possesses, the greater the ability to concentrate all of nerve power in the relation which she willingly engages in for reproduction, in a pure monogamic love that is not robbed of the fineness of the relation by the degradation of partial or complete compulsion. While such a relation is not love, there must be love with it, or it is an injury to both parties in the transaction. With love and respect there comes a peaceful, satisfied condition of both body and mind. Excess, however, brings irritability and unrest. This would be avoided by sleeping separately. Much of the disgust that at times is so unbearable would be avoided if the matters of making and unmaking toilets were done in separate rooms. Few people are so bound together in soul that there is not an ill-concealed disgust for private toilet matters, and even the ordinary arrangement of the clothes. However pleased with the person when clothed, the dressing and undressing transition after a little time becomes an endured unpleasantness. Several cases have come to my knowledge where women could not void fluids when their husbands were in the room, no matter how dark the night or how long they had been married. Women have suffered much and made an effort to do so for an hour at a time, and although in severe pain because of the necessity, it was impossible to be relieved until they were entirely alone. Men have had to partially dress and stand outside of their own rooms in hotels before their wives were able to get relief. Children are often severely punished for not attending to the calls of nature before retiring, and invariably doing so as soon as put to bed and left alone. If they were tied in their toilet chairs and left alone for a few minutes, the result would be accomplished. This is a peculiar condition of the system that few grown people understand. They can understand their failure to respond to the calls of nature when they enter a closet that is so disgusting that the inclination of nature immediately leaves them. Fistulas often result where a person so disgusted is placed where there is no alternative but to visit such a closet. Every house, however small, in towns and cities ought to have closet plumbing where water flows abundantly, so that the calls of nature would not be so dreaded and postponed. It is found that constipated bowels caused by postponement of the calls of nature so irritate the organs of sex that much of immorality is the result. There must be an equality of rights of the organs of the human system. If one is free to eat and drink, there must also be freedom to evacuate the solids and fluids in order to make peace in the system. All should know the evils of exciting influences on the organs of reproduction, and both boys and girls should be equal in such knowledge. Men as well as women suffer from inequality of knowledge as well as of rights and privileges in the various relations of life. Men who deny any rights to women on account of their superior physical strength sooner or later have their rights as men interfered with, because the sentiment of tyranny is ever encroaching more and more. It is not safe to deny any one rights that belong to all. In the Middle Ages, men were mutilated, castrated, so that they could sing like women in their choirs. They would not admit the women in the choirs at all, and the great injustice to women was visited upon the sons of men, because they must have the voices of women and could not get them without mutilating men when they would not acknowledge women's right to sing. Mutilated men are devoid of fine sensibilities and are harsh and unfeeling and even cruel. These cruel men were and are to this day the guardians of the women of the harems. They accompany them whenever they are allowed to go out, and hold them under constant surveillance. Women herded in this way bear children that are tyrants from birth, being marked by those who tyrannized over them. Their failure to make advances in civilization is owing to the manner in which the women are treated. But a few years will elapse before the men of this country will be able to see themselves reflected in the glass of as gross inconsistency as the men to which we refer. Men may laugh at the idea of women singing in public, or even uncovering their faces, being out of women's sphere and out of the delicate proprieties of life, and making women unfit to be wives, or even good enough to be called women. But let men remember that it is only a piece of the same barbarism that allows men to be the dictators of women in anything that relates to existence. Nothing less than perfect equality of rights will ever result in the greatest happiness and the grandest possibilities. Enlightened women look upon any interference with human rights of women, whether as regards a failure to pass a law to protect women in her clearly expressed rights of suffrage in the Constitution, or any human rights, as being as great a barbaric wrong as men can possibly deem the mutilation wrongs of men. They differ only in degree, but not in kind, for both stab in the same direction. Both seek to be the masters of the special functions of sex. A marked instance of oppression to women, resulting in cruelty to boys, is apparent in the Turkish harem, where boys from 10 to 15 years of age are kept in large numbers for licentious acts in the rectum, which results in agonized death from inflammation. Enlightened countries are becoming more just to women, but still we are shocked with facts like the following that will soon be obsolete in England as they are already in America, owing to the advance of public sentiment beyond the codes. Not many years since, an English court decided that a man might beat his wife with a stick not larger than his little finger, continuing to legalize this relic of barbarism. If a woman was untrue to her husband in Athens, he could take away all her property, beat her, and sell her at auction, but he could do what he pleased. Mohammed ordained that untrue wives should be buried alive, but afterwards decided that they should be stoned to death. In Egypt, an untrue wife's nose was cut off, while in Germany her hair was cut short. In the Polynesian islands, the wives are not allowed to eat the same food as the husbands or cook it at the same fire. In China, the women have so many disadvantages that they are constantly praying that in the next world they may be men. Husband and wife may mutually agree to separate, but if the wife leaves without his consent, he may strangle her. Talkativeness or disregard of parents-in-law are causes for a man's divorce. All of these inequalities of sex have their penalties, but we have neither time or space to elaborate truths that need but a mention. It is because of the inequality of rights of sex that so much of outrage is perpetrated by men of all ages. Rapes on little girls of 2 or 3 years of age are attempted by young men, often giving them venereal disease. Boys from 12 to 18 years of age are often found attempting to outrage little girls, and as boys commence so young to pursue the vices so well understood by the constant talk before them of men hardened in crime. No boy is too young to read this book, and his special attention should be called to the chapters on pure manhood and the language of the nerves. Small boys should learn that vice so degrades the boy that the man is capable of outrages far worse than murders, and that by slow degrees the tempter wins. Then step by step they give up all and become perfect demons. And as an illustration, the following is related. In the war with the Larmates, Emperor Proclus in 15 days violated 100 virgins who were his captives. American men will violate their wives while menstruating, which even an American Indian is never guilty of doing. Perfect equality of men and women in all the relations of life would produce the best results to men as well as women. End of section 2. Section 3 of Unmasked, or the Science of Immorality, to Gentlemen, by Mary Edwards Walker. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Pamela Nagami. Chapter 3. Pure Manhood. We have searched books in vain for any description of a pure man. We expected that in works devoted exclusively to men, where virginity of women is so freely discussed, that the virgin man would have a descriptive mention, but in such books as in all others we have failed to find any mention of the physical signs of manhood virginity. Such a neglect in works advocating either pure marriage or continence is, to say the least, most remarkable. But a scientific and metaphysical writer cannot let the subject rest until investigation proves whether or not women alone has signs of a virgin condition, whether such signs are not equally marked in man. It would not need much thought to conclude that any portion of the body put to new use would be likely to be changed in some measure, and particularly a portion of such importance as the procreating organs. The signs of virginity in woman is a topic that all writers on private treatises, whether to men or women, always speak of, and make a theme of the greatest importance in proving the chastity of women, as though man had any more right to expect to find a perfectly chaste wife than woman had to find a chaste husband, and not until within a few years has the world been very well enlightened upon the subject, and learned that even in some marriages there has been only external copulation, yet conception has taken place, and a hymen as perfect as is ever found seen by the attending obstetrician. On the other hand, after marriage, when perfect copulation has occurred many times, the entrance of the vagina has contracted so rigidly when the act is repeated that more effort was required to complete copulation than at the first act after marriage. These facts, learned from the most reliable persons, prove that the copulation signs of chastity in women are not to be relied upon, and by so much stress having been placed upon such signs, much of wretchedness has resulted to men for want of confidence in their wives' chastity, that has been cruelly thrust into the wives' faces, who were powerless to explain the difference between a delicate little membrane at the entrance of the vagina called the hymen, that has been forced to yield so soon after marriage, that the relaxing moisture of the parts has not prepared it to yield without great effort and pain. In after conditions where the system of women has received all of that kind of excitement that it can bear, the muscles of the vagina contract and refuse to receive more, although the woman may still desire to gratify her husband, even if not at the time congenial to her. Most married men have had the hymen theory very much muddled by this after condition at all periods in the lives of married women. But very few men ever stop to consider their own inconsistency in demanding such purity from their wives, since if they were themselves pure they could not so readily doubt the chastity of women. It is strange that men can be so thoughtless as not to know that their own want of confidence in the maidenly purity of their wives, and their ability to judge of the same, would lead their wives to distrust them in their own youthful purity, for how can a young man judge of a wife's condition if he is not able to draw comparisons with a mistress? Had not women studied the medical profession, and studied into this one-sided virtue business, the world might still have gone on without women ever knowing that the signs of man's virtue are unmistakable, although there are but few comparatively who are virtuous long enough to know themselves what are the sure signs of a virtuous man. We doubt not that by far the greater part of men in middle life and old age believe that there are no signs of virtue in men, but that what is a sign is undeveloped manhood, since they have not thought upon the subject enough to consider the time and cause of the physical change in the penis. Men make their wives believe that the power to make an erection and leave the frenum praeputii of the penis all next to the scrotum is simply an omen of perfect manhood that is developed with time and gradually grows away from its attachments. This is all false, but it is a story generally told wives who are always contrasting the difference in the attachments of the cuticle on infants and the freedom from attachment of the same on their husbands, and hence the very natural question as to the time when the change takes place. So firm and unyielding is the attachment, and so painful any attempt to free the same from near the head of the penis, that only under the greatest excitement a number of times will it tear away, and every time there will be some more or less slight blood discharged from the torn membranes. Masturbation will not tear this away, sexual relations alone will do so, and when this unmistakable sign of man's virginity is generally understood, boys will, with proper training, make men that will honor manhood. Young women who are not chaste have not dared to marry doctors, and the time has arrived when young men who are not chaste do not dare to marry doctors, for the same reason that young women have had, and continue to have, and the time is not distant when young men will not dare to marry pure women anywhere, however young, for all women will be informed upon this subject. A number of men living to be 30 years old and over have married with unmistakable signs of having lived a perfectly pure life, and the harshness upon wedding nights that unchaste men have been guilty of was impossible for them because of the effects on their virginity, not only, but that selfish, reckless disregard of a wife that unchaste men evince in the sexual relation is not known, but a tender regard is ever observable. Where husband and wife are both virgins, the sexual relations on both sides will be moderate and mutual and satisfactory and soothing, for husband will not seek to gratify unreasonable desire, because he will not have such a desire. It will be weeks and perhaps months before the fullness of the relation is experienced by either, just as it is always some time before the fullness is reached by pure woman without regard to whom she is married. Chaste women who marry unchaste men are often 3 months in reaching, and sometimes never reach, a perfection of orgasm in sexual relation, owing to the fact of the husband having lost magnetic power by his unchastity, and thus unfitting himself to become a father for her children, by being unable to father the highest type of humanity that shall be superior to both parents, which should result. The loss of virginity in men and the failure to live chaste lives is more a misfortune than a fault, as is often the case with women. Men are, when mere boys, allowed to go into all sorts of chance company, with little or no regard to the moral character of the same, with no warnings as to the results on soul, and seldom a word about the results on the body. Parents, mothers as well as fathers, think, because the public places so low an estimate upon the morals of men, that they have few if any responsibilities regarding the morals of their sons. They cannot bear babies and bring disgrace upon them, and they have little or no organized thought about sons bringing disgrace into other people's families. Few people look away beyond disgrace. That is but the opinion of other people. They do not get a sight of the wrongs to their bodies that are not immediately perceptible. The masses of men reason but little on the most important subjects relating to social life. They are contented to know the arts relating to the attainment of passional aims and the ordinary preventives of deleterious results, but they do not even learn the plain lessons taught constantly. What will spoil the horse will spoil the man. The variety and excess of the horse causes him to be excited beyond control at the sight of a mare, no matter of how inferior breed and how poor condition she may be at the time. And so men lose by variety the nice sense of selection and the power of control, and take any women they can that chances to be near, for like the horse, licentious thoughts are ever uppermost in their minds, and they conclude that there is not a woman in the world but that would pursue the same course as himself with her price paid. There are large numbers of men who cannot be made to believe that there is a single man or woman who live pure lives, because their own lives and their observations of others have led them to such a conclusion. One of the most common expressions from men when the subject of pure manhood is alluded to is this: men are all about alike. Some are more shrewd than others. No man can ever tell how chilling such expressions and those of similar import are to pure women, who would love with a worshipful devotion the embodiment of pure manhood. But men cannot understand such chilling of the soul until the best women make similar assertions about all other women. Imagine such a condition, ye good men, and see if, no matter what troubles you have braved like philosophers, see if, we repeat, you do not require all your brains to resist suicidal inclinations. Nothing else in life comes home to the soul with such crushing weight as the loss of confidence in sexual purity. Life seems to be robbed of the charm of all charms when the permanent friendship of uncompromising confidence has been destroyed. Only the skeleton of the individual is left. What was thought to be genuine substance proves to be but a fleeting shadow in sunshine that is lost altogether in twilight and darkness. For with the disregard of pure selfhood, saved and retained for the partner of life, there is loss of so much of fineness of soul and body, power of soul and body grandness, that it would take volumes to write out all the same in a complete manner. The horse cannot have sexual relations with a cross bulky mare, a big-legged mare, one of inferior size, inferior breed, or of any description, and ever recover from the magnetic effect. The parts having contact may be immediately washed after the relation, but there is no power to take from him the mare's impress left upon him, that will be transmitted sooner or later to his posterity. So marked is this that some of the colts from the best breed of mares, sired by the best breed of horses, have partaken of the dispositions and looks of mares that held sexual relations with the horse months and even years before. The male takes upon himself these magnetisms to a wonderful extent. Indeed, they become as much a part of him as are his feet or any other part. So it is with men, and they take up these magnetisms and retain them in their systems and transmit them to posterity. Men may discard the women with whom they have had sexual relations, but they will find, no matter how low or degraded they may have been, that their children will inherit the traits and often the looks of their mistresses. This is a law that cannot be avoided, but does not stop here. Like all other great laws, there are many deleterious effects that loom up in importance as we follow the various winding paths outside of the clearly defined one of rectitude. The worst effects as regards such transmission comes upon men, because the life and power of the spermatozoa is magnetic in its unconscious life and power, and receives from the man the wonderful but as yet but partially understood impress upon the nerve centers that time can never eradicate, and when this subject is fully understood by boys, they will cut off their own right hands before they will thus wrong their own soul's tabernacle, and destroy the power to give to their posterity the sublime traits of their pure wives. Prostitution will never be stopped until men are educated on these points, and it is because we so fully realize this that we have done what no other woman has dared to do, lectured and written to men exclusively on these important subjects. But we have not yet reached the depths of the injury that promiscuous relationship brings. As soon as conception takes place, the blood of the spermatozoa begins to circulate in the veins of the wife, and the magnetic power of the spermatozoa also diffuses itself into the magnetism of the wife. The circulation of both increases in strength and quantity the whole 9 months, and so the very elements of the unchaste that the husband has gathered up in his former relationship with those unfortunate women is circulating in the bones and muscles and nerves of his wife through the arteries, veins, and nerves, and she can never eradicate it from her system. Not only will the children inherit more or less of all these traits, but in thousands of instances have the once pure wives had so much of the prostitute elements, or thieving elements, or drunken elements pervading their system from the husband inheritance, that they have eventually been overpowered by them, and the good originally in such wives has lost the controlling power in their whole organization. That these effects on different people are varied according to the laws of the modification of laws, as yet but very imperfectly understood, must be acceded to by all reasoners. Close observation tells us that these mysterious laws can be delved into still deeper than human eye has yet peered, and that from a knowledge of what is now already clear, we may yet solve unthought of problems called unknowables. There are those who can never be convinced of intricate facts unless the most striking evidences are witnessed, like a blonde woman whose blonde husband has had sexual relations with a squaw or an African, becoming the mother of a genuine papoose or a pure African child. The law of modification often steps in and gives a specimen of a child where only the Negro texture shows itself in the rigid curls of the flaxen hair, or of a complexion and hair that is midway in color. The peculiar traits of character, disposition, and predisposition are often more marked than the looks of the face, and not infrequently the want of tenure of life is a telltale of no small moment, and the only easily discovered evidence of outraged law. There is another depth regarding the influence of the magnetism of presence that is still more difficult of explanation than even the mysterious contagious elements of disease as seen in fevers, smallpox, or epizootic, that could not have originated from any process of fear in the minds of horses, unless they have reasoning powers that they are supposed to be deficient in, or unless there is a power of mind in the human that is so infused the animal hundreds of miles away that the effects were the same as though there had been actual exposure to the disease. We often feel most miserable in the presence of some people without any seeming reason, and feel happy in the presence of others, experiencing an indescribable something in regard to such presence that we know not how to commence to investigate. We feel it beyond our mental depth to reason it out, and like the mystery of mysteries that we every day behold in nature, we yield the point and plod along with a reluctant dismissal of the whole subject from our minds for the time, as the too barren results of such thoughts weary us, without convincing us that their solving is an utter impossibility. The deeper one delves into metaphysics, the wider the field seems to expand. Dr. Franklin touched the keynote of electricity for the business world, but who shall be able to so trace humanity's magnetic power, and so touch its key, that the masses shall heed its moral warnings? The world must be made better by understanding the intricate laws of human development in body and in mind, for the masses to comprehend the physical effects of unchastity outside of the production of illegitimate children or of venereal disease, but little reading is necessary if plain language is used. But the wonderful effect upon the mind requires such deep methodical thought that but few minds are accustomed to habits of clear arrangement of their thoughts, so that they could express themselves intelligently on subjects that must reach the deepest convolutions of the brain. As the sexual relation calls for the most intense nerve excitement and the strongest and most powerful and concentrated emotions, so does it as surely call forth and receive the brain impressions that, in spite of all other considerations, are lasting and transmissible. And those who associate in the sexual relation with the low, the ignorant, the vile, the fickle, the unmethodical in thought, the undeveloped in mind, cannot avert the law of effects upon themselves that they are powerless to throw off. Many a man of brilliant talents and fine culture has become a mere cipher in the world from this cause. Many that have attained intellectual eminence have failed to become the bright stars they might have been but for this cause. It is lamentable that the incentives to pure manhood are so few. Those who are the honorable exceptions in society with all kinds of codes of honor are not the favored men of the time, because they are so rare that women do not know how to treat them, and so they look upon them and see the worst rakes present the favorite beau of the evening with the purest women of all ages. Such is the demeanor of a pure man that the women are not aware of his purity, only in exceptional instances. The purest of women, with their general association with men not morally sound, do not appear the same women used to when there was less corruption among men. Men themselves do not appear the same, if we can credit those who lived a half a century since as young men and maidens. But let us hope that we shall see no deeper degradation of sex, but that with knowledge shall come rapid strides toward a pure manhood, with those who have ignorantly degraded themselves, and that knowledge shall be so diffused that the young men shall all grow up as pure as they could wish the young women to be, that they shall sometime marry. End of Section 3. Section 4 of Unmasked, or the Science of Immorality, to Gentlemen, by Mary Edwards Walker. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Pamela Nagami. Chapter 4, Hermaphrodites. Perfect hermaphrodites are very rare, although all cases of partial defective organs of sex are generally spoken of as hermaphrodites. Cases are related where persons, after having been married as men for several years, were afterwards married as women, and in both relations there was mutual satisfaction, with the exception of there being no posterity. What were the antenatal conditions of these cases, no one is able to relate as far as we are informed. They are always licentious, owing to an inheritance of the same irritability of the organs of sex and to defective moral sentiments that were antenatal conditions. They never menstruate unless they have a penis, and then the menstrual flow is never passed except when they urinate. The parents of children born with defective organs of sex have always felt that they were disgraced, and in some way at fault for such an occurrence, although they generally have no definite idea of the direct cause. It has been our fortune to have complete histories of such cases from our own observations, and it needs but little evolution of thought to establish principles that are axioms with such keys. Hermaphrodites are but legitimate results of abuse of either or both body and soul. No woman's body can be abused without a suffering of soul, and vice versa. We relate cases to prove our position in instances so marked that the least logical cannot fail to be convinced of the correctness of our position. Mr. Blank married a fine, healthy, and beautiful girl of 18 years of age when he was about 22. He had been living in a promiscuous manner since he was 15 years of age, with no restraints upon his animal nature, daily cultivating the same until he lost the power of self-restraint. He had no respect for womanhood, and no regard only so far as he could be sexually gratified, and the remonstrance of his wife when menstruating, the disgust at the time and the terrible debility and irritability after, had no effect upon him, but to complain of her want of disposition to please him. She, of course, had no business to have any thought about herself. Herself and orphan sister of 16 years were sole occupants of his house. Every night he had sexual relations with his wife 3 or 4 times, except when she was menstruating, and then he, a little time after marriage, made his wife's menstrual period an excuse to force the sister into such relationship. He was so brutal and tyrannical, and such were his threats of vengeance if they either left the house or exposed him, that the matter was kept quiet. His wife bore him 1 child, a daughter, and both wife and sister died soon after with consumption caused by venereal disease that he had given them. The child is now about 8 years of age, feeble and timid, but utterly devoid of any vagina. No doubt but that mother's mind was so firmly fixed on her child, if a girl, being protected from man's abuse, that her mental influence caused the physical defect in her daughter. A young woman of 25 in this same condition married a man in Washington, D.C., and when the discovery was made by her husband, a divorce was the finale, although she begged and pleaded for the friendship of marriage and consented to allow him any immoral liberties he might desire with others. 2 families of young couples in New York were living near neighbors. Each had 1 child. Their intimacy resulted in one of the men taking the other man's wife and eloping with her. After a few months they returned, and the affairs were so settled that one couple again lived in their married relations. The deserted wife became enceinte soon after, and as soon as she was sure of her situation, she applied to her physician for medicine to destroy the fetus. When we told her that we could not give her anything, she remarked with a great deal of anger that as her husband had once deserted her, she hoped that if her child was a girl, that it would never be able to have a husband's relation, and if a boy, would be never able to be a husband. When the time of her accouchement arrived, we attended her and found the child entirely wanting in a vagina and anus. The external labia were present, and an enlarged clitoris that was really a defective penis, from which both the urine and feces were voided. But there was no other developments of sex, and without any seeming cause except the painful passing of the feces. The child died in about a week. Among those who saw this strange freak of nature was Mrs. Sophrona Felini, whose husband was an eminent Methodist clergyman stationed at Rome, New York. The author became acquainted with Miss Feli while a student years previously at an institution largely endowed and named after her parents in Fulton, Oswego County, New York. This lady's sympathies led her to call upon the poor mother of a child whose defective organs would preclude all grand intellectual possibilities, not only, but cleverness in any direction. A man about 30 in a good position with a quiet, immoral reputation was married to a girl of 20. One child was born before a year had passed, and a second one in a year later. This last was 6 or 7 months old when we were called to see it. The anus was perfect, as was the testis, but the penis was defective and resembled the enlarged closed clitoris just described and illustrated. There was no cuticle close to the pubes nor over the bladder for a space half as large as an ordinary saucer and much of the shape. The muscles were and had been from birth as perfectly exposed as though the cuticle had been removed with a knife. Serum was constantly exuding, so agonizing the child that no one but the mother could be induced to endure its never-ceasing irritability, moaning, and frequent screechings. The father had compelled the mother to submit to sexual relations every night 3 times, and every day before he took his dinner, up to the day of her accouchement. Pleadings and explanations of disgust and agony were all unavailing, although he used no stimulants except cigars. This man has held a position given him through the ballots of the people, men. To the credit of the Jews be it said that their religion protects women for 12 days out of every month. Is it surprising that so few women among the Jews will ever marry men of other faiths, when there is no protection for them? These outrages are beyond the sphere of men's legislation, and when wives are goaded into suicides or murders, where can a man be found that peers into the facts of the case? Such women are too poor to fight with law for divorces, and have too much maternal love to leave their children, well knowing that men's laws will not give them to their real owner, because mothers cannot support them according to their judgment of what a proper support for a child must be, forgetting that a mother will bring up her children better alone in poverty than with a bad husband having wealth. While we write, thousands of women are praying for death to relieve them from sexual abuse, looking no farther into labyrinths of the evil effects of sex tyranny than their own personal agony. Men will be better when the true principles of social life are fully unmasked. They reflect their knowledge of social life from their own standpoint, but how dense and dark have been the clouds through which the few rays of grandeur of soul have been reflected. The effects upon the mind are not so clear to the masses, as mental efforts require thought to discern them, and the masses obtain more ideas from sight than from thought. Thinking wearies more than looking, and the power of methodical thought is not easily acquired without some inheritance, although it is acquired by a course of training. There are but few metaphysical minds, and such learn how difficult it is for the masses to progress where much thought and reasoning are required. The clearest, the most lucid arguments are often counted for naught because the average mind cannot grasp their full meaning. A great amount of systematic thinking is required to trace cause to effect and effect to cause, and the masses, not being methodical thinkers, fail to grasp the full scope of deep reasoning and to delve deeply into metaphysical subjects. But the facts related regarding well-known cases of hermaphrodites and the every day to be seen marks of mothers on children ought to arouse thought among men of but ordinary intelligence. In every community there are many cases of people with clearly defined antenatal marks upon them, and some who are deformed from the same cause. A gentleman brought a large orange to his wife, who was enceinte a few weeks. She thought it would seem far from generous not to divide, although she very much desired the whole of the orange. When her child was born, there was an orange attached to its back with a little stem. A young woman who was a few weeks enceinte had her sympathies so aroused regarding a child about 7 years old that could not talk, and believing its mother derelict in trying to teach her, took the case in hand, but failed to better her condition. When her child was born, it was deaf, and at the present time cannot say but a few words, although much older than children who talk well. There are many cases of blood marks on the face caused by the enceinte mother having a favorite animal slaughtered, or being shown an injury of some sort. It is needless to multiply cases. Facts suggest remedies in many cases. If anything in diet is longed for, it by all means should be procured if possible, as there is some want in the system that ought to be supplied. When unusual sights are forced upon the attention, woman ought to be instructed to place her mind upon the subject, and resolve that it shall not affect the child in utero, and particularly should women resolve to have perfect children as regards sex, that there should be no more occasions for letters similar to the following being written. Doctor, at your request, I furnish you the following statement. About the year 1848, a patient in man's apparel, aged about 28 years, applied at the Cleveland, Ohio Medical College for treatment as a clinic subject. The external genital organs were those of a male of usual development, except that the scrotum contained no testicles. The subject complained at regular intervals of about a lunar month of pains in the pelvic regions similar to those of menstrual colic, followed by a free menstrual discharge from the urethra, penis. This monthly discharge had been regular from the days of puberty, continuing about 5 days and gradually subsiding and entirely ceasing until the succeeding period. The subject was suspected by the faculty of being a hermaphrodite, and after the lapse of a year or two an opportunity was afforded for verifying the facts by the death of the patient. A post-mortem examination revealed the most interesting fact that there was in this individual a complete double sex. The uterus was of normal size and form, the fallopian tubes of usual diameter and length, admitting the introduction of a small probe to the ovaries which were of natural size and structure. The fimbria was natural, the os uteri well developed, projecting naturally into the vagina. The vagina of the average size and structure opening into the urethra about an inch, perhaps less, from the neck of the bladder, there being no external signs of a vaginal opening or vulva. The testicles were located about midway upon each side between the uterus and ovaries in a fold of the broad ligaments, and were about 2/3 of the size of those of average male adults. A section showed a normal internal structure, but the microscope did not reveal the presence of spermatozoa. The pubes were more prominent than in the average male, and well clothed with the usual hirsute covering. The writer of this sketch made 2 plaster cast models of the external and internal organs, including the bladder and rectum and other parts in situ. Dr. Garlick, now living at Bedford, Ohio, assisted in the autopsy, and the specimen with one cast is now or should be in the Museum of the Allopathic College, and the other cast was deposited in the Museum of the Homeopathic College, both of Cleveland, Ohio. Professor H.P. Gatchell, now living at Highwood, Illinois, and Professor Pult, now living at Cincinnati, Ohio, were present with the undersigned when the examination was made, upon which the above sketch is based. J. Brainerd, M.D. Washington, D.C., January 4th, 1878. The above was furnished the author with permission to publish by Professor Brainerd. A number of other eminent gentlemen in the profession, besides the professor and those mentioned by him, were witnesses of the autopsy. The author. In closing this chapter, we are not blind to the fact that whoever makes an attempt to elucidate principles not conceded to be such by those ignorant of the same, and others related to them, may not receive all the benefits that the author hopes for in the immediate future. But the leaven of scientific truth cannot fail to be a power when there shall have been time for the important leavening process in the minds of the millions who err from ignorance of great principles that sham modesty has prevented them from having facilities to acquire. End of section 4. Section 5 of Unmasked, or the Science of Immorality, to Gentlemen, by Mary Edwards Walker. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Pamela Nagami. Chapter 5. Morning Sickness in Men. It is well known that but few enceinte women escape morning sickness in the first part of pregnancy, and some suffer all through the 9 months. But that the husbands of such women should suffer instead of them has always been a mystery that has called forth no further explanation than it was because of sympathy. There have been instances where the first symptoms of the enceinte condition of a man's wife was his own sickness of the stomach in less than 24 hours after her conception. So unvarying and so marked has this been that a rude joke has come from other men that they could always tell to a day when a certain man would need a doctor for his wife. This has been a source of so great annoyance that men thus affected have kept as much out of the way of jokers as was possible, even to the injury of business matters. Jokes in any form in relation to the giving of life and immortality are beneath people with any pretensions to a knowledge of the grandeur and responsibility of human antenatal development. The sickness of the stomach is owing to the sympathy that exists between the nerves of the uterus and the nerves of the stomach, and as man has no uterus or womb that he should suffer all the terrible nausea and his wife be perfectly free, is owing not to an ordinary sympathy, for he could not sympathize before his wife knew her own condition, neither could he sympathize because of witnessing a deathly sickness of the stomach in her, since she does not experience any. Therefore we must delve for a deeper reason, and in so doing we find that it is the wonderful, fine, magnetic intelligence that is communicated through her nerves to his nerves. In a word, these nerves of the organs of sex are wonderfully knowing and have a wonderful power of telling before the brain does, and have powers superior to the organs of speech in communicating such knowledge. All married people learn of acts and motives of each other in this wonderful manner, and the freer they are from any sexual wrong, the clearer and truer will be the knowledge thus gained. Unthinking, unreasoning people even often get distinct ideas of moral wrongs through this nerve power, when they have no other means of knowing, and it matters not how much such an untrue person may protest that the true one has no cause for jealousy, blown away by a breath of denial. Many wives get distinct ideas of the existence of a wrong of some kind, although they do not always get distinct ideas of just the character of such wrong. Men sometimes take the pains of their wives, and thus relieve them from suffering without any intention to do so. It is not always a sympathy that exists between married people that causes them to take each other's pains, but a power that is not yet fully understood. As an evidence of this, a man whose wife was taken with severe labor pains in the middle of a bitter cold night refused to go to a neighbor's for a long time, telling her she could wait until morning if she tried. He at last went in an angry mood and left the outside door wide open. His wife said she wished with all earnestness and prayed that he might have just as severe pains as she had, that he might understand her sufferings, and soon after her pains left, and a neighbor woman came to her alone, saying that her husband had such pains that he had to lie down in the street until he got over them. These pains continued at intervals after his return home, all through the night and until her child was born, while her own pains were scarcely felt. We are acquainted with parties who were themselves cognizant of the facts in the case just related. Men who have morning sickness when their wives are enceintes would find that it would soon cease if they would obey the great law of justice to antenatal posterity, by allowing all the strength of the prospective mother to be given to the child in utero, instead of making sexual demands upon her. This is not always true, however, for young men who run away to another part of the country or even to foreign shores to cure dyspepsia, when they have seduced girls and left them in enceinte conditions, find that the world is not large enough to get away from the great law of the language of the nerves. That cannot be controverted. Every man ought to understand that much of the suffering of wives from sickness of the stomach, both while pregnant and at other times, is a result of copulation. End of section 5.